Dinosaur hunters of the Old West, unearthing a past as valuable as any treasure. The truth about what was, next in the Real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forests were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
Up until the early 1800s, there was no knowledge that monstrous reptiles actually existed here on Earth. To those exploring and settling the Old West, it was a land already filled with awe-inspiring revelations. Majestic canyons a mile wide, what appeared to be almost primordial landscapes of boiling water erupting from the ground, and vast herds of primitive-looking horned beasts roaming the plains. It seemed to be a land formed at the very beginning of time. But then strange things started to be discovered. Old bones from beasts, unlike any known creature, were being unearthed all over North America, and especially out in the West's arid, eroding landscapes. Soon a new type of explorer was coming west. Men involved in the new science of paleontology were leaving their academic surroundings in the East and joining the other adventurers on the frontier. Like the miners of the gold rushes, paleontologists raced westward, armed with picks and shovels, hoping to strike a mother lode of their idea of riches, the fossilized remains from a bygone era. What they found changed man's understanding of life on Earth and of time itself.
The animals and plants that were found as petrified remains out in the West indicated to the scientists and explorers that were traveling through that area of the country that it had changed a lot through time. That instead of the rolling sagebrush plains and the buffalo and antelope that now live there, there were in fact times where dinosaurs roamed the landscape, with palm trees and ferns and a warm tropical environment.
The Rocky Mountains had not yet risen. The western landmass was generally low. Occasionally the earth would quiver and the land would rise, perhaps in volcanoes, and rivers would flow eastward to the sea. Lots of moisture, lots of plant growth, lots of flowing water to sustain life. And the dinosaurs generally found these living conditions very favorable.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the areas of the Great Plains in Kansas, at the time of the dinosaurs, they were covered by a gigantic sea that sort of cut across the middle of North America. And this sea was full of things like plesiosaurs, which were marine reptiles with these huge long necks, and mosasaurs, which were gigantic seagoing lizards that had developed paddles instead of fins that swam the seas of Kansas.
There were other times where camels, rhinos, and eventually huge woolly elephants occupied that area of the country, indicating that there were many times represented there and many times of environmental change reflected by the various animals and plants that were being found in the fossil record.
One of the early people to collect fossils was Charles Wilson Peale. He found a mastodon, a skeleton, complete skeleton of a mastodon in upstate New York. And he dug that out. That was Peale's mastodon, and he was quite a painter. And one of the famous paintings in American art history is his large painting. It's entitled Exhumation of the Mastodon. And it shows all these people digging out this mastodon, which was an elephant-like animal. Another person who was very much interested in early times in the fossils of North America was Thomas Jefferson, the president.
Well, Thomas Jefferson was a great figure of the Enlightenment. He was a very intelligent man, an amateur scientist. Remember, in 1800, the word scientist had not even been invented yet, so he didn't know he was a scientist. He was a philosopher, a natural historian, a breeder of plants and animals, lively interest in natural history.
Jefferson was such an aficionado of fossils that part of the unwritten agenda of the Lewis and Clark expedition was also to bring back a lot of these fossil bones. They happened to pass through very rich fossil areas, but they were not skilled or trained enough to notice what they should have been looking at. And so they walked right by some major dinosaur finds. When they returned, that was when Jefferson decided to send Clark down to Big Bone Lake, Kentucky to retrieve mastodon bones. In fact, there were so many fossils there that hunters passing through the area would use these gigantic mastodon vertebrae as camp stools around their campfires and around their tents. Jefferson also took a room in the presidential mansion and set that up as a paleontological museum for visiting dignitaries to see and visiting scientists to examine these fossils. He saw the study of fossils as a real wave of the future. He was very visionary in that respect.
But Jefferson, the politician, couldn't afford to get in the middle of the battle between science and religion that was already heating up. So the next important steps in paleontology happened in England. In 1822, Dr. Gideon Mantell was treating a patient out in the countryside of England when his wife spotted some strange teeth protruding from the earth. They had had an interest in paleontology, and Mantell determined that they were from an extinct prehistoric reptile. Mantell dubbed his new creature Iguanodon. Then in 1841, British anatomist Sir Richard Owen classified these ancient beasts as Dinosauria, and now dinosaurs had their name.
Now, Sir Richard Owen, at the time of the Crystal Palace exhibit in London in 1854, had an artist named Waterhouse Hawkins working with him, and they made a life-size restoration of Iguanodon. And they made it to look like a heavy rhinoceros-like animal, which it wasn't at all. But it's inevitable that their first restoration should be pretty inaccurate because they didn't have much to go on.
It was in 1856 that Joseph Leidy described the first dinosaurs of North America. More importantly, Leidy's reconstructions were more accurate and widely accepted than those done in England. But Leidy, a quiet and studious man, would soon be eclipsed by America's most famous dinosaur hunters, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope.
Marsh and Cope were contemporaries. They were about the same age. At first they were friends when they were young men, but they were both very independent people, you see, and they soon became rivals, and they became very bitter rivals. It turned into a race between them as to who could find the most, who could describe the most, and publish the most, and it's sort of unique in the annals of paleontology, what they did.
And of course, their competition to find the most dinosaurs would inevitably lead them to the great fossil fields in the West.
Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West will continue in a moment. We now return to Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West.
When compared to the other paleontologists of the era, Othniel Charles Marsh and his rival Cope had a distinct advantage. They both were able to pursue their chosen field with little regard for making a living.
Othniel Marsh had the good fortune to be the nephew of George Peabody, one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Marsh convinced Peabody to let him go to Yale, and Marsh became this brilliant student of paleontology. Eventually, Peabody was convinced to bequeath $150,000 to begin the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University. It seemed like a darn good idea to make Othniel Marsh the very first professor of paleontology in the United States at this museum. So Marsh was well on his way to being the preeminent paleontologist in the United States, if not the world.
Edward Drinker Cope chose his parents very wisely. The Cope family did very well. It was a prominent Quaker family in Philadelphia. He was born in 1840 and grew up in Philadelphia. He was educated at a boarding school outside of Philadelphia. And as an 8-year-old boy, he was sketching fossils at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He was a very precocious, very energetic, very brilliant, very interesting man.
Although originally a fairly amicable relationship, one of the things that probably precipitated the feud was the restoration done by Cope of an Elasmosaurus. Marsh pointed out to Cope that in fact he had done a fine job of restoration. However, he had put the head on the tail of this animal. This infuriated Cope, especially when he realized that he was wrong. This particular mistake was oftentimes brought up by Marsh regarding Cope's work, and that it was inaccurate and too hastily done.
Marsh, Cope, and Joseph Leidy knew that the really big finds were out west, so they headed out that way. At times, they all pursued different aspects of paleontology, and Marsh sometimes took his students out on explorations. But whenever dinosaur bones were found, even America's wide open spaces proved not to be big enough for egos the size of Marsh and Cope's. This was especially true at a place called Como Bluff.
It was in 1877 when William Harlow Reed, a section foreman for the Union Pacific Railroad at Como Station, a small station in southeastern Wyoming, was coming back from an antelope hunt. As he traveled down the hillside, he came across some large bones. He recognized that these bones must have been from some ancient prehistoric animal. Reed traveled back to the station, excited about his find, and told the station agent, William Edwards Carlin, that he had found these remains. The two gentlemen traveled 60 miles to the south, to Laramie City, to send a letter to Othniel Charles Marsh.
The fact that Reed and Carlin traveled to another city and that they only signed their middle names to their letter must have meant that they were aware of the rivalry between Marsh, Cope, and other collectors. Secrecy was a must if they were going to be paid for this information. Marsh deployed his crews to the area and they found a 7-mile-long ridge packed with bones. A find of this size was impossible to keep secret, and soon Cope, Leidy, and other collectors were digging in the area. Marsh considered Como Bluff his and wasn't about to let anyone, especially Cope, try to get the advantage.
Marsh had his network of spies all throughout the area and had in his employ the telegrapher who was sending out all of Cope's messages. So anything that Cope sent out, the guy on the telegraph keys would also immediately send it over to Marsh, so Marsh knew everything that Cope was doing. Cope also would spy on Marsh, and in fact, every day at a certain time in the afternoon, he would sit up on top of this hill and with binoculars, and Marsh knew exactly what was going on. So early in the day, he would have his workers assemble a bogus animal out of all these different bones, make up this fantastic creature, and then cover it up with dirt. a few minutes after Cope would set up and start spying on him, he would have his men pretend to act real excited like they had just made the find of the century, jump up and down and start digging stuff. And then later, Cope would write papers on this fictitious animal.
Very often, the collectors for Marsh would come back after the rival collectors had left for the day and fill in their quarries. So it would take them all the longer to be able to remove the bones. It even went so far as the destruction of bones, just so the rival collectors couldn't find them and send them back to their respective scientists.
Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West will continue in a moment. We now return to Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West.
As the public became more and more fascinated with all the dinosaurs being discovered, many people out west realized that bone hunting could be a worthwhile pursuit.
The value of bone, particularly dinosaur bone, meant that people that lived out here could go out, find the material, and ship it back to these big scientists and would get paid for it. Not as frequently as they would have liked, but they did, in fact, get paid for it. So economically, it was probably more advantageous to be looking for dinosaur bone than it was to be trying to eke a living out of a dry farm, say up in Wyoming.
One of the most successful of the independent dinosaur hunters was Charles H. Sternberg. He had gotten interested in fossils in his youth and made them his life's work. He had 3 sons, and they all worked with their father at his dig sites as they grew up. And then they went on to become part of the next generation of North American paleontologists. Now, whether searching for bones independently or being affiliated with the big institutions back east, the act of fossil hunting was about the same for everyone.
In an area where fossils are common, one first does prospecting. One walks around looking for a bone eroding out of a hillside. When bone is located, it begins as work with hammer and chisel and pickaxe and shovel, clearing away overburden. When you get close to the fossil, then you get down on your hands and knees and you start working over the fossil with hand tools, with awls and needles and brushes.
Collecting fossils has always been, on the whole, hard work. And the early dinosaur hunters, or the early paleontologists in Western North America, had a pretty hard life. They were in country that had not been settled yet. They had all the elements to contend with. The whole system of supply, logistics, was pretty primitive. They had to get their food and everything and haul it in by horseback or wagon.
Charles H. Sternberg spent his first 4 years as a fossil hunter working with Cope. In his memoirs, he describes the intense heat, bad water, and indigestible food they endured. He also reveals that those hardships, along with the feud with Marsh, may have been taking their toll on Professor Cope.
When we went to bed, the professor would soon have a severe attack of nightmare. Every animal of which we had found traces of during the day played with him at night, tossing him in the air, kicking him, trampling upon him. When I would wake him, he would thank me cordially and lie down to another attack. Sometimes he would lose half a night in this exhausting slumber, but the next morning he would lead the party and be the last to give up at night. I have never known a more wonderful example of the will's power over the body.
Some watercolor paintings and letters by Arthur Lakes, a teacher from England who worked for Marsh at Como Bluff, illustrate how difficult the work could be. When an underground spring erupted into one of the pits they were working in, Lakes wrote that it became more like fishing for eels than digging for bone. When Marsh decided that the digs should go year-round, Lakes wrote Marsh, who was back at Yale at the time, to let him know what it was like during the harsh Wyoming winter.
Collecting at this season is under many difficulties. At the bottom of a narrow pit 30 feet deep, into which drift snow keeps blowing, fingers are benumbed with cold from thermo 20 and 30 below zero. And snow, often blowing blindingly down, covers up a bone as fast as it is unearthed.
Getting the bones out of the ground was only the first step. Next, they had to be packed and hauled out for shipment back to the museums. Fossil bone is very brittle and is easily shattered, and many of the early shipments arrived in small pieces. Some give a man with a medical background working for Marsh credit for first treating the fossils like broken limbs by making a cast around them before shipment. It is also thought that Cope may have first improvised this technique that would become the standard procedure in paleontology.
One of the things that Cope hated about being in the field was having to eat rice. He really hated rice. Cope and one of his cohorts got this idea, well, wait a minute, what if we take that rice, boil it down, get the glue, and take the burlap bags that it comes in, cut those into strips, dip the strips into this glue, and then wrap those around the fossils to protect them. They'll hold everything together until it's shipped back east, and boy, we've got our fossils all intact in one piece. They're not falling all apart.
Another concern of all Western fossil hunters was possible Indian attack. Native Americans were suspicious that the men with picks claiming to look for bones were really after gold. But Cope seemed to have little concern for his safety when he decided to ignore warnings and go fossil hunting with a small group of men not far from where General Custer and his army had just been annihilated by the Sioux.
Cope is a Quaker. He's a pacifist. He does not believe in warfare. He's not fearful of contacts with Sioux or Crow. And when they arrive there are 2,000 Crow camped across the river. But the Crow are preparing for their annual buffalo hunt, their annual bison hunt. And their intentions are absolutely peaceful, no problem whatsoever. As a matter of fact, one morning they came upon Cope at the wash basin, and Cope was scrubbing his false teeth. And when he saw them coming, he quickly put the teeth into his mouth. And the Crow chiefs were amazed.
They thought that Cope had some kind of bizarre magical powers to be able to take his teeth out and clean his teeth and put them back in. So they nicknamed him Magic Tooth, and they became great friends.
Marsh also developed an interesting and ultimately more significant relationship with Native Americans. He had been ordered to stay clear of Red Cloud and the Sioux by the local Indian agent, but took his crews into the area anyway and managed to gain Red Cloud's trust.
Red Cloud invited him to the reservation and said, look, I've got to show you some of this stuff. And he showed him the sacks of grain that were all riddled with vermin droppings. And he showed him the cloth that was all full of dry rot. Well, Marsh was really incensed that this was going on. And Marsh took this directly to the newspapers. Immediately after that, Red Cloud got word to Marsh that the Indian agent had cut off all supplies to the tribe and that they were starving.
And so Marsh, actually, a man of his word, went back to Washington, and basically he raised Cain. Now, Commissioner Delano, very unwisely, attempted to paper over the affair, smooth it over, say it was a misunderstanding, it wasn't true. Basically, he defended his Indian agents. What he didn't understand was how well connected politically Marsh was. The next day, Marsh visited President Grant. Before the end of the year, Commissioner Delano had resigned, and the treatment of the Sioux, in this instance, changed.
Red Cloud was grateful to Marsh for his efforts on behalf of his people. He later came east to visit his friend. They posed with the peace pipe he had sent along with a message that hailed Marsh as the best white man I ever saw.
Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West will continue in a moment. We now return to Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West.
Legends go way back, of course. One of the early legends, or if you might call it a misidentification if you want to, in North America, was made by Cortez, who conquered Mexico in 1519. And he tells about them finding the thigh bone of a giant in Mexico. Well, it was obviously the femur, the upper leg bone of a big mammoth, a big elephant, you see. But they sent it back to the King of Spain, and it was a royal treasure.
Even before paleontologists came to the western United States, Native Americans had recognized fossils as being special kinds of objects. In Utah, there are some archaeological sites where trilobites are found with holes drilled through them, and they were apparently strung on necklaces. In other cases, fossil invertebrates like ammonites are found inside medicine bags. Now, these objects were recognized as being special by Native Americans, even though they had no concept that these belonged to animals that lived hundreds of millions of years ago.
When native peoples find bones in the ground, it's hard to say what it is they think. There are some very interesting examples of fossil discoveries being translated into legends of some kind. An example of a persistent legend is the legend of the Cyclops. That is the legend of some creature with a single eye. And we find in Europe and in Asia, and quite plausibly among native North American peoples, a Cyclops legend which may arise from the discovery of a skull of an extinct elephant, a mammoth. Elephant trunks are never preserved, but instead a single hole in the middle of the skull where the trunk was. And this is often interpreted as a large eye hole. So this could be the basis of such myths.
In the late 1700s, early 1800s, the idea was presented forth that there was such thing as extinction, that these bones were from animals that no longer existed. And early paleontologist Thomas Jefferson refuted that, said that that could not possibly be, because God was so great and good that he would never, ever allow any of his creations, any of his animals to become extinct, and that we just hadn't explored far enough west. If we did, we would find those animals living.
And then a lot of people in the 19th century and even up into the 20th century just wouldn't believe in fossils. For example, it was often made a point of that fossils were put in the ground with the devil to confuse good Christians.
In 1858, Darwin published Origin of the Species, and that sort of dropped like a bomb in the scientific and religious worlds, sort of drew the line. And just as the United States was being torn by the beginnings of the Civil War, so were the worlds of science and religion. And it brought a tremendous amount of conflict to a lot of scientists who were also devoutly religious, because this was questioning the very basics of their beliefs.
The conflict between science and religion created quite a furor. Cope and Marsh, being two of the most publicly visible figures in paleontology, were well aware their work was not embraced by everyone.
Marsh had been working up in the Green River Basin, and in that area he found a number of small mammals that were early ancestors to the horse. He called them Eohippus, Epihippus, Bezohippus. Hippus means horse. And when he decided to go ship the material back east, he ended up having to go into Ogden, Utah. And he was really quite concerned about going to Ogden because that was Mormon territory. And the Mormons were largely creationists. They believed in a 6,000-year time period for the existence of the world. But when he got there, there was a big party going on. And Brigham Young was there, took him up onto the stand, and he said, "Professor Marsh, I have only one question to ask you. Were there horses in the New World before the white man came?" And Marsh reported, thinking to himself, not wanting to look a gift hippus in the mouth, he told them, yes, there were horses. What I didn't tell them was they had gone extinct at least 11,000 years before the present.
The significance of that encounter was that Marsh's discovery of horse remains in North America validated a passage in the Book of Mormon that states there were horses here before the Spanish arrived. But that occurrence was fairly early in Marsh's career. Towards the end, the controversy was getting the better of him.
Marsh was undone by the fundamentalists. They started to attack what he was doing with the famous phrase, birds with teeth. They would question that all these public tax monies and fundings for his expedition were going to fund this harebrained paleontologist who was just out to look for birds with teeth. And that was sort of the rallying cry that undid Marsh. Congress pulled the funding out from under him, and he hence lost his commission as the paleontologist for the U.S. Geological Survey.
By the end of Marsh's career, he had exhausted his inheritance from his uncle George Peabody. Even though he still enjoyed some celebrity within scientific circles, his glory years of discovery and fame were over. But by this point, his rival Cope was not faring well either. He had made some unwise investments in mining, and his funds ran dry. His days of exploration came to an end, but he continued to publish his findings.
Cope, in his lifetime, a brilliant and very productive scientist, published 1,400 papers. 1,400 papers, a staggering scientific output. But one of the ideas that Cope got into his head, one of the scientific ideas that was prevalent in the late 19th century, had to do with the idea that the size of the brain of an individual was an expression of his intelligence. And so, ever competitive, ever combative, he challenged Professor Marsh to a posthumous experiment that when they each died, their brains would be removed from their skulls and the size of their brains would be measured, and let it be recorded by history which man had the larger brain. Well, Cope died on April 12th, 1897. He was only age 57. He died relatively young, but his wishes were carried out. His brain was removed from his body. His skeleton was prepared. His brain was measured. It was a large brain, some 300 cubic centimeters larger than the average human brain. No question, it was a large brain. Marsh, however, who died in 1899, did not follow suit. So we do not know the size of Marsh's brains. So history was spared this little contest.
The competition was finally over. Cope's brain would remain preserved on the shelf among other artifacts of the past. But their infamous feud should not be allowed to upstage their accomplishments.
The rivalry that Cope and Marsh had spurred both of these individuals on to find a tremendous diversity of ancient animals out in the West. Animals like Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, and the thunder lizard, Brontosaurus. In fact, the foundation for later paleontological studies would be based on the work done by Cope and Marsh in the late 1800s.
Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West will continue in a moment. We now return to Dinosaur Hunters of the Old West.
Just because Cope and Marsh had passed on as the 1800s were coming to an end, that doesn't mean the era of important discoveries had come to a close. The American Museum of Natural History in New York sent crews out to start digging in the famous quarries at Como Bluff. After a year of work at the site, it was clear that the area had been pretty well cleaned out. But explorations a little further north revealed an incredible find.
The bone cabinet, the bones were found all over the ground, littering the ground. They're photographs taken before work started there, just showing bones everywhere. They'd eroded out, and a lot of people thought they were boulders, I suppose. Evidently, the sheep herder thought they were just ordinary rocks, and he built his cabin out of them. But they were an indication of how prevalent the fossils were at that particular locality, which was worked then for many years and yielded a lot of fine material.
Although early on, dinosaurs were not put on display for the general public, in the 1890s, various Eastern museums, backed by wealthy financiers like Andrew Carnegie, wanted to fill their museums with unique show-stopping displays. When Andrew Carnegie in 1898 read an article in the New York Herald telling of the most colossal animal ever on Earth just found out west, he wanted one. and instructed his director to buy one for Pittsburgh and included a check for $10,000. Carnegie had crews sent out to the West to look for the dinosaur called Brontosaurus giganteus. They traveled out to Wyoming to meet the discoverer of this enormous beast. The individual was William Harlow Reid, the same man who found Como Bluff in 1877.
Reid had to admit that all he had found of the dinosaur Carnegie wanted was part of a single leg bone. The crews continued to work anyway, and on July 4th, 1899, they found their benefactor a worthy dinosaur and named it Diplodocus carnegii.
Carnegie wanted to get more of these so he could give them away to various institutions around the world. And he spoke to the director of the Carnegie Museum, who made it clear to Andrew Carnegie that these things weren't laying around in large numbers, and you could look for many years without ever finding another one. And so Carnegie had the original specimen of Diplodocus carnegii cast, and then he distributed casts all over the world. He gave them in England and South America, Europe and Asia, kind of left it as his rather prehistoric calling card.
Out in Southern California, another unique site was becoming world famous at a place called Rancho La Brea. For 40,000 years, oozing tar pits had accumulated a treasure trove of bones from prehistoric mammals.
The bones of many of the animals that were found at Rancho La Brea by many of the local inhabitants of the area in Los Angeles and the local ranchers thought that these bones belonged to domestic stock that had gotten trapped in the asphalt pits and died. It wasn't until the owner of the ranch at that time in 1875, Henry Hancock, had given over a few bones that he had collected over a period of years to an old friend of his named William Denton. Well, Denton was very excited about this discovery because one of those bones happened to be the upper canine tooth of a saber-toothed cat, and Denton recognized immediately the significance that this specimen represented a totally extinct animal.
For whatever reason, when Denton published a paper on the La Brea fossil deposits, it was virtually ignored. Prehistoric mammals never captured the headlines like dinosaurs. And to those living near the pits, the tar was the valuable commodity. At the turn of the century, the focus became the oil that the asphalt pits indicated was under the ground. An oil geologist working in the area knew all the bones he was finding were something special. So he brought them to the attention of Dr. John C. Merriam of the University in Berkeley.
Well, Merriam was ecstatic, and he spent several summers coming down to Rancho La Brea from Berkeley to make collections himself, and then finally generated enough interest to have full-scale organized excavation of the park area. During the 8-month period when Berkeley was excavating there, they found well over 500,000 specimens out of just 2 sites, so that gives you an idea of just how rich 1 or 2 of these sites can be.
The amazing amount of fossil material found there gave a clearer picture of what life was like in North America during the age of prehistoric mammals than ever before. Henry Hancock's son George now owned the property. He understood the scientific importance of the treasures of the tar pits and protected them by deeding the 23 acres of land they were in to the county of Los Angeles. Now, around the same time the work at the tar pits was going on, a paleontologist from Philadelphia named Earl Douglas was getting close to bringing about the grand finale to the golden age of fossil hunting in the Old West.
One of the great ironies in Earl Douglas's career is that although he never had any research interest in dinosaurs, he ended up finding one of the greatest dinosaur quarries ever found. He was in this part of Utah following his own research specialty, which were mammals that lived after dinosaurs had gone extinct. And he received orders from the Carnegie Museum to move up in this area and look for dinosaur deposits. So he ended up going to an area they wouldn't normally have looked at to begin with. In the course of doing that, found the great dinosaur quarry.
On August 17th, 1909, Douglas went up a small ravine, and there was an outcrop of sandstone up above him, and he thought he could see bone associated with it. Went up the hill, and at that spot he found 8 tail vertebrae of what he called a brontosaurus, and they were articulated. The bones were together, as they should have been, as in life. This was a major discovery in that when they started digging, not only did they find one dinosaur, but they found bones of other dinosaurs mixed in with it.
The quarry that Douglas found contains a spectacular record, a sample of virtually an entire dinosaur community that lived in this part of the United States about 150 million years ago. And it includes plant eaters and meat eaters, brontosaurs, stegosaurs, camptosaurs. All of them are found here in one great quarry. One of the things that really worried Douglas was that someone would come into this area that was federal land and file a mineral claim on the quarry and then charge the Carnegie Museum an exorbitant fee to collect these dinosaur fossils. So the Carnegie filed a mineral claim with the federal government, but it was denied on the grounds that dinosaur bones could not be interpreted as a mineable mineral as they were then understood.
Douglas and the Carnegie turned to influential friends in Washington and eventually got the attention of President Woodrow Wilson, who agreed that this site should be preserved.
So in 1915, when Woodrow Wilson made this a national monument, he was creating not only a scientific preserve, but in a sense, an area that would educate and, in a sense, astound the public for generations to come. And yet, in another sense, he inadvertently established what turns out to be a magnificent tribute to all of those individuals who struggled so hard in the Western United States to bring the past back to life.
This is the Biography Channel.
You want to be yourself, but you're not allowed to be yourself.
This is the Biography Channel.
I was just beside myself with anger and disappointment.
This is the Biography Channel.
I'm the only actress he knows you have to pay to keep your clothes on.
Reality meets personality, only on the Biography Channel.
Biography Channel. What a concept!